This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Barney Frank says that a repeal of the Wall Street Reform Act that bears his name will never happen as long as a Democrat is president. Professor Lee Drutman has written a book about the power of lobbyists, and he says Congress is merely a farm league for K Street. And Bill Press talks with the fourth-ranking House Democrat Xavier Becerra about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and his own Senate aspirations. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. How has the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act worked out? Very well, says co-author Barney Frank, who also has some thoughts about the situation in Baltimore, the lack of affordable housing, and police unions. And for more than 4 decades in the Massachusetts State Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives, Barney Frank was at the center of the struggle for personal freedom and economic fairness. In 2010, he co-authored the most far-reaching and controversial Wall Street reform bill since the era of the Great Depression and helped bring out the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Now retired from Congress, he has written an autobiography called Frank, My Life in Politics, From the Great Society to Same-Sex Marriage. Barney Frank, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Oh, I'm glad to have the opportunity.
And we appreciate your time. As one half of the Dodd-Frank Act that tries to protect consumers from Wall Street, what can you tell us about its success so far, the prospects of Republicans significantly weakening it, and any changes that you think could be made?
Well, obviously, 3 very good questions. So far, it has worked very well. There's been one problem with the implementation, and it hasn't bitten us yet, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But frankly, there were the major critics, obviously, of this were the Republican Party, which overwhelmingly voted against it. I think out of the, more than 240 Republicans who were in Congress at the time, a total of 5 voted for it. And to the Republican argument that, well, they really were not opposed to any regulation, they just didn't like what we did, 2 points totally counter that. Because the Republicans clearly were enthralled to their own absolute fundamentalist ideology that you never have any government intervention even after a pattern of abuses, and also for their political base, including their contributors. In the House, under the rules of the House, you get to make one last motion as the minority before a bill is passed, and that is your preferred version. You get to do a total amendment. It's called the motion to recommit, and you can offer exactly what you want. No, you don't need anybody else's permission. This is your version of what should be done. The Republican motion that embodied their view of what we should have done in response to the terrible crisis that we had in 2008 and 9 was to make no regulatory improvements whatsoever. Literally, the motion they presented would have terminated the TARP program, which was about to be terminated anyway, and it would not have changed anything with regard to subprime mortgages, with regard to derivative transactions without money to back them up, without anything else. In the Senate, Senator Dodd had called a meeting of his committee to consider amendments from the Republicans about what should and shouldn't be in the bill. This is their argument. Well, we understand you need some regulation. We don't like what you did. The Friday before the meeting that was to be that next week, he got a phone call from his counterpart, the Republican Senate Leader Richard Shelby, who said, we're not offering any amendments. In effect, what the Republicans did was simply oppose the whole thing. Now, despite that, it has worked reasonably well. First of all, the notion that it was going to kill the economy, the stock market, on the day we announced in the House what we were planning to do, March of 2009, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was 6,500. It has very nearly tripled in that period, an unprecedented increase. The fact is that the economy of the United States, and after all, the financial institutions exist not for their own profit or their own enhancement, but to facilitate economic activity in the real world. Our economy has, A, had problems because of what President Obama inherited, the worst economy in so many decades, and B, it's been the best performing economy in the world. So the argument that we have somehow hindered things is just wrong. To some of my friends on the left who think it hasn't had any impact, once again, the Independent Consumer Bureau, Elizabeth Warren's idea, which I was very proud to work with her to enact, has saved billions for the taxpayers. And recently, we've had two other examples of how important the important impact of this. General Electric, GE, had gone into the financial business. They didn't think they could make enough money making things, so they got into financial manipulation. They got in trouble with that. And recently, as a result, in part of what we put in the bill, the extent to which we've made it harder to engage in these kind of financial manipulations in which you make profits theoretically with no real gain to the economy, I believe, GE just got rid of its financial activity. They said this has gotten too hard. We don't like these rules. We can't play by these rules. And by the way, the financial community said, "Oh, good idea. Yeah, you're better off just making things." Secondly, AIG, which is the company whose massive indebtedness triggered this controversy because they got into these derivative things and couldn't pay for them, they have just announced that they are going to change their business model, go back to a simpler basic insurance model without the manipulation. Now, the one thing that happened that troubles me, I believe the single biggest cause of the crisis was the shift in the making of loans. 50 years ago, when someone made a loan, they lent it to a borrower who was going to have to pay them back. And if you're going to be paid back by the borrower, you're careful about who that borrower is. Then they came up with, for a variety of reasons, securitization, where the originators of the loans would make loans to people and then sell the loans. So they didn't have any sense of any need to have them be people who could pay it back. We put into the bill what I thought was the single most important thing called risk retention. If you're going to make loans and sell those loans, the person who buys up those loans and puts them into a security to sell to the investing public takes the first 5% of the loss. To get the bill through the Senate, we had to have a little bit of flexibility there. The regulators, to my disappointment, overdid that, and I worry that they have not done enough to impose that kind of discipline. But other than that, I think it has worked well. The economy has gone well, and the banks are safer now. They have higher levels of capital. They are less likely to be indebted and not be able to pay it off. And as I said, two of the major institutions that had trouble before, AIG and GE, two non-banks that had gone too much into banking, financial type stuff and gotten into trouble, are backing away from that as a result of the bill.
Were you better off?
Last point, I'm sorry.
No, well,
can I ask one last point?
Oh, absolutely.
You asked a central question that I ignored. The fact is that all of this, however, will disappear if the Republicans win. There will be no further erosions. President Obama signed an appropriations bill that had a weakening of it, not a huge one, but regrettable. There was a great outcry against that. Nancy Pelosi, Elizabeth Warren, I was able to join in. As a result, the president has now reasserted that he's not going to accept any weakening of this bill. And the point, though, is that like a lot of other things, climate change and the future of the Supreme Court's decisions on campaign funding, those are all at risk in 2016. So the answer is if a Republican wins the presidency in 2016, we will go back to where we were in 2008 with no regulation.
By sitting on their hands when you were trying to get this thing done in the first place, though, they were obviously, in my opinion, they were setting it up to fail, or at least they thought so, and it hasn't. It's been successful. Isn't there pressure on them to continue this, at least maybe even put their mark on it now then, even if they do take over the presidency?
That's a very good question, and here's the deal. If you will notice, they are not being honest about their intention. They're talking about, well, we want to make a little change here and a little change there. If you look at what they're really doing, they're trying to get rid of the whole thing. Unlike health care, they have never, in these years when they took over the House, moved to repeal the whole thing. But here's the problem. Even without repealing the whole thing, if any of the people now running for president as a Republican is elected based on what he and even she has said with Fiorina, they will appoint people who will not use the powers. You can do some things as a matter of statute. For example, the bad loans that were made, and one of the great ironies of this, one of the great frustrations, the right wing is now saying that all this happened because liberals were forcing banks to lend money to poor people who couldn't afford it. Exactly the opposite is the case. Exactly. Liberals, Democrats, we saw that these loans were hurting poor people, and we tried on several occasions. I hope people will read my book, read the appendices, where I document the 3 or 4 occasions, 3 for sure, when liberals tried to do legal things to block these bad loans, but because the Republicans were in power, They undid it, and it wasn't until we came into power that we were able to block the bad loans from happening. That's fixed in law. But in everything else, there has to be discretion. You can give regulators the power to stop bad things, but you can't force them to use it. For example, in 1994, on this very point, Congress, the last time the Democrats controlled Congress until 2007, passed a bill directing the Federal Reserve System to stop predatory loans, to stop loans going to people who couldn't afford it. And Alan Greenspan then announced, as the head of the Federal Reserve System, that this was interference in the market, and the free market knew better, and he wouldn't use the power. And unfortunately, at that point in 1995, the Republicans had taken over Congress, so the Democrats were unable to change that and force him to do it. So the danger is that the Republicans, without admitting that they want no regulation at all, will appoint people who will in effect do that.
We're speaking with former Massachusetts Congressman Barney Frank. His autobiography, Frank, My Life in Politics, From the Great Society to Same-Sex Marriage. Do you think Dodd-Frank was your greatest legislative or political achievement?
Well, it's first of all, you start picking, you sound kind of egotistical. I would say this. It took a lot of work, but in the end, it was more of a negative thing in the sense what the financial reform bill does is to stop bad things from happening. It's not, it didn't house anybody, it didn't feed anybody, it didn't clean up the air. I have probably equal sense of accomplishment in the package of things I did on lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender rights. When I came to Congress in 1980, and there were bumps and grinds, but gay people couldn't serve in the military. It wasn't until 2010 that we got that one fixed, and it was because Nancy Pelosi was the speaker, and she made me her lieutenant, and we got it done. There was an immigration law in America that said if you were gay, you couldn't immigrate. We not only got rid of that, we established the principle that if you were gay and being persecuted in another country, you could get asylum here in America. We had a security clearance policy that Dwight Eisenhower had put in, that John Kennedy kept, and Lyndon Johnson, Jimmy Carter, of course, the Bushes and Reagan, which said that if you were gay, you couldn't get a security clearance. You couldn't serve your government. You were unworthy. We got rid of that one. So the collective action on LGBT issues, I thought, was very important, including in the 80s. We succeeded at a time when we weren't sure we could in getting funding for both research to combat AIDS and money to help care for people with AIDS in the face of tough right-wing opposition, but we were able to win that one.
Mm-hmm. Turn it on you just a little bit. You are an expert on urban housing and other issues affecting people living in poverty and bad conditions. To what extent does housing play a role in the kind of situation that led to the riots in Baltimore?
A very serious one, and that's been one of my other issues that I've worked on, and I've had some success, but not as much. I joined the committee on banking, as it was then called, in 1981, and I later became chairman because of the seniority system. I always point out to people, they say, "Oh, how'd you get to be chairman of such an important committee?" Well, one guy died, and another guy got defeated, and another guy ran for the Senate. When I tell people how I got to be the chairman of the committee, I like to quote Viscount Melbourne, the British aristocrat of the 19th century, who was very upset with democracy and egalitarianism. And he once said that the only thing he left that he approved of was the Order of the Garter, because it was awarded with no damn nonsense about merit. And that's how I became chairman. There was no damn nonsense about merit. But for the 32 years I was in the House, there were two consistent themes I had. One, trying to cut military spending, and two, trying to expand the stock of affordable rental housing. I'm glad you asked that question. We are, I think, unduly critical of teachers with regard to children from terrible economic backgrounds. Well, it's kind of hard to be the teacher of a kid who has no place to sleep, who's cold, who's bitten by bugs, who has no place to study, who doesn't have that basic thing. There's a clear correlation between bad housing and health care. So the absence of decent housing, affordable decent housing, is a real problem, because either people are housed in very bad conditions in these economic strata, or they are paying so much for housing that there is very little left over for other important things. So I've tried very hard to increase the supply of affordable rental housing. And by the way, that's one of the issues that is now being fought about in Congress between the parties. One of the things I'd worked on, there's an excellent organization called the Low Income Housing Coalition, and its leader, Sheila Crowley, I write about this in the book, is a great saint for trying to deal with this. And we finally said that part of the money that goes to financing single-family mortgages through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac will be put into a trust fund to build units of affordable rental housing for low-income people. And that got caught up in the crisis. Finally, last year, former Democratic Councilman Mel Watt, who's the head of the agency that oversees Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, implemented that. And tragically, the Republicans in the Congress today are trying to wipe it out. That is, we finally got a steady stream of money to build affordable rental housing, which is very much responsive to the problem you talk about. And that's one of the issues that the Republicans are now trying to absolutely wipe out. And I've made the point, look, I don't want to lend money to low-income people for housing that they can't afford. That hurts them, and we try to stop it. But you have to have some other way for people to live decently. And as I said, that's people I hope will watch closely, because that's one of the issues where the Republicans are about to undo one of the major advances we were able to do in the last few years.
And you know, in the light of national debate over police-community relations, how should liberals approach issues of policing?
There needs to be, and I've written some columns about this, the problem is that the police have but they've been unaccountable. Now, look, most police officers do a very important job well, and they have a tough job. And yeah, we do ask these police officers to engage from time to time in physical combat with people who are bad and who may be armed. So this is not an easy job. On the other hand, there will be elements when this is abused, particularly since racism has been the besetting sin of America. We've diminished it, but it hasn't gone away. And the third factor is that we have laws on the books that we're not serious about. So by that I mean you don't read about the police being racist in the basically when they're dealing with murderers. You don't have law enforcement problems of dealing with serious crime. The problems of racially biased law enforcement comes with things that society really isn't serious about making crimes, like the drug laws and other low-level offenses. And those are the ones where there's too much discretion. So I think my proposals are a couple. One, repeal the laws that prosecute people for using substances that we don't think they should use. And I mean by that not just marijuana, but heroin and cocaine. Those are inherently discriminatorily enforced in our society. Secondly, there has to be a mechanism for disciplining that minority of police officers who will misbehave and misuse their authority. And the police here are culpable. They have, I don't know, if you watch the cop shows, I watch them, and I have a lot of friends who are police officers. Actually, I probably have more friends who are police officers than many other people kind of in my area politically, because there are a number of openly gay police officers, and as gay people, we talk about things and have worked with things. And they validate the point. If you watch the shows, the police officers who are assigned to police other police officers, the internal affairs people they're called, they're hated. They're despised. Well, shame on the cops, the people who are supposed to enforce the laws against everybody else, for unanimously, apparently, fighting against any efforts to police even their own people, policing them. In other words, they say, well, you can't send in people who don't know anything about police work to discipline us. But when you have police officers who have the job of trying to keep other police officers from being abusive, they run into great opposition. So there needs to be an institutionalized mechanism whereby police officers can be disciplined, police accountability boards. Those are very important. The criminal justice system is going to work only rarely. Trying to get a jury to convict a cop in ambiguous situations is very hard. But there can be much better administrative discipline. And one of the great ironies, by the way, is you see the Republicans trying to bust unions, but make an exception for police unions. So what they're doing is strengthening that abusive position.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Barney Frank, autobiography titled Frank, My Life in Politics, From the Great Society to Same-Sex Marriage. And I'll continue to jump around with you a little bit here. Free trade or fair trade has always been a bit of a difficult issue for Democrats. What's your view on it, specifically the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP?
I have a column in this week's, I recently wrote a column for the Portland Sunday Telegram that's going to be out, and I think our position should be this. There's been a shift. 40 years ago, the economics profession had a kind of conservative bias on two important issues. They said that minimum wages would hurt low-income people more than help them, and that free trade was an unmitigated good. There's been a great change in the sophistication there. By the way, on minimum wage, people now realize it can do a lot of good, and the kind of free market argument against minimum wage increases has dropped. With regard to trade, there is now a consensus among intelligent people that trade in a developed society like ours has two impacts. First of all, it does increase the overall wealth of the country. Secondly, it does it in a way that exacerbates inequality. There was a recent article in the Sunday New York Times a few weeks ago by a man named Gregory Mankiw, who was the chief economic advisor to George Bush. And he said, look, it's a very simple proposition. We'll export those things where we're good at making them, where there's sophisticated processes needed, and those things that can be produced more cheaply elsewhere, we'll have to import them. Yeah, but different people make different of those things. And so my proposal is this, and it's the one area where I'm critical of President Obama. He put into his budget some very good proposals to reduce inequality, some things whereby federal policies could improve the status of working people. They're being blocked by the Republicans with the full support of the business community. The business community is in a big union-busting mode. They're resisting any kind of fair taxation. They've generally been supporting opposition to reasonable policies. What the president should say to them is, look, your highest priority is international trade. Properly done, a trade bill that does not include some special provision where foreign businesses can sue to kick out our regulations, and with requiring some appropriate environmental and worker standards, we will support free trade if you will stop your war against our efforts to diminish inequality, if you will stop trying to bust unions, if you will support an increase in the minimum wage, if you will support my proposal to make it possible for go-to community colleges, we can have a deal. That is, I think Democrats should say, we will support trade, a bill that's properly drafted, because it will help overall economically. But we also insist that that can only happen if it is accompanied by a wide range of measures that undo the unfair distributional effects it have. And this goes beyond simply saying, if you lose your job specifically, we'll get you another job. The negative effects on working people of international trade are very broad. And the president is making a mistake. He's saying to the business community and the conservatives, I will support your number one priority and not do anything while you continue to kill all the things that are high on my priority list. And Democrats ought to say, yeah, let's make a deal. You want trade? Fine. Support the increase in the minimum wage. Support unions. Let's tax the hedge fund people who are getting away with insufficient taxation, et cetera. In effect, take some of the increased wealth that you get from international trade and use it to offset the negative effects on working people that very increase will have.
Before we let you go, campaign finance reform. We desperately need it. We sort of had it. Can we get it back?
Yes. If the Democrat is elected president in 2016, we talked about this with regard to financial reform. It's also true of climate change. This is a very important election coming up. I hope, this notion, there's no difference between the parties, that people will see through that. The Supreme Court voted 5-4 to make the campaign finance system go away. There are now no rules, and money has total dominance. Most of the time when a Supreme Court decision comes, it has precedential value. But a 5-4 decision that's fairly recent, that was this bitterly contested, has no such protection. There are 4 Supreme Court justices out of the 9 who are around 80 years old. It is very likely that the next president will get to appoint replacements for at least 2 of them. Interestingly, 2 of the 80-year-olds are on the side of unrestricted campaign spending, and 2 are for restriction. So the next president will either reinforce the Supreme Court majority that says you can't limit campaign spending, or appoint justices who reverse that decision. And so this is going to be one of the most important issues on the ballot in 2016. Do we maintain this Citizens United decision, which allows money to just flood the zone and corrupt our politics excessively, or do we appoint justices, have a president who will appoint justices who will put reasonable restraints back in?
Okay. Barney Frank, the autobiography, Frank, My Life in Politics, From the Great Society to Same-Sex Marriage. Barney Frank, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Professor Lee Drutman is an expert on lobbying. He says Congress has outsourced its job to the lobbyists on K Street. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
All right, boys and girls, gather around me and I'll tell you the story of the Investor-State Dispute Resolution Clause. Wait, children, where are you going? Don't run away. Don't cry. Okay, the wonkish gibberish used by the powers that be to write those corporate boondoggles they call the trade deals is toothacheingly boring and incomprehensible. Could that be on purpose? Of course. If they wrote these wage-destroying, environment-killing, sovereignty-sucking scams in plain English so we commoners could understand what they're doing to us, they couldn't get away with it. So here comes the Trans-Pacific Partnership, by far the largest trade flim-flam in history. Written in gobbledygook, it was negotiated in secret by corporate lobbyists and government lawyers. Even Congress doesn't know what's in it, but TPP is to be hustled into law through a super-rush rubber stamp process called Fast Track. No need to be suspicious, though, for an upstanding new group called Progressive Coalition for American Jobs now assures us that this global trade deal will support hundreds of thousands of new jobs in the United States. Hello, do we have sucker wrappers around our heads? That's the exact same claim that Bill Clinton made for NAFTA, which siphoned hundreds of thousands of jobs and entire industries out of the U.S. By the way, who are the members of this coalition? Every progressive group I know of is adamantly against the TPP, and no progressive has stepped forward to claim ownership of this PR push for corporatizing the people's democratic rights. Is there a coalition? Who's in it? Who funds it? This is Jim Hightower saying, nobody's answering because nobody's there. The coalition is a fraud, just like TPP. For a real coalition of progressives who are standing tall against the whole fraud, go to stopfasttrack.com.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Corporate lobbyists spend 34 times as much money trying to influence Congress as does the combination of organized labor and public interest groups. And Professor Lee Drutman says that means corporations have every seat at every table.
And we say hello to Lee Drutman, political scientist who researches political influence, a fellow at New America. He's the author of a book, The Business of America is Lobbying, How Corporations Became Politicized and Politics Became Corporate. Lee Drutman, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Pleasure to be here with you, Jim.
Yeah, nice to have you with us as well. And you are an expert on the role of lobbyists in Washington, and clearly you want to reduce their influence. So, what's wrong with citizens and interest groups advocating for their cause to their elected officials?
Well, I actually think we need more of citizens advocating for their cause. to elected officials. I think what's the problem of lobbying in Washington is that it's become incredibly imbalanced. So you've seen this remarkable growth of corporate lobbying here in Washington, where I'm speaking from. And I write about this growth in my book, but you have a situation where the countervailing forces, citizen groups, just don't have the same volume that the corporations have. So I think we need actually more citizen involvement in politics and more groups in Washington that represent dispersed citizens, consumers, taxpayers. So I think that's the problem is balance. It's not one of citizens participating.
One versus the other. It's how heavy-handed one is, and the other doesn't have that kind of power.
Well, it's just when large corporations can spend $2.6 billion a year on lobbying, both individually and through associations, that's 34 times what labor unions and public interest groups combined spend on lobbying. It means that they're hiring lobbyists who can be everywhere all the time. There's a saying in Washington that if you're not at the table, then you're probably on the menu. And what all this lobbying spending has done is that it has allowed large corporations to take up almost every seat at almost every table, and it's left no room for anyone else. Increasingly, it's the big companies that are, in fact, writing the menus.
So the amount of power that lobbyists wield in the day-to-day grind of legislating, has it just essentially, have they replaced staff?
Well, look, since 1980, you've seen that congressional committees actually have one-third fewer staff than they had in 1980. Same time, there has been a six-fold increase in lobbying. The world has become a more complicated place. There are a lot more demands on a congressional office, and members of Congress and their staff really can't keep up. There's a lot of bright, energetic folks who are working in Congress, but they tend to be young, not as experienced. As soon as they get some real experience, they leave, often to become lobbyists. And so then the next crew of people have to rely on lobbyists. And it's this cycle. Essentially, you have Congress that is a farm league for K Street, and a Congress that has outsourced the basic capacity of doing its job to lobbyists, and most of those lobbyists represent large corporations.
We're speaking with Lee Drutman, fellow at New America, author of the book The Business of America is Lobbying, How Corporations Became Politicized and Politics Became Corporate. If given the opportunity, how would you change things to give members of Congress and their staffs more power to control the policymaking process? I mean, would paying congressional staff more even, paying them more, would it even come close to what they can get by becoming lobbyists?
Well, certainly paying more would help. And I mean, it's true that they probably would earn more as lobbyists, but I think a lot of people in Washington really enjoy working in Congress, and they'd like to stay. The problem is that there are a limited number of spaces because staff for congressional offices have basically remained flat over several decades. Pay is not great. The working conditions are not great. They're in cramped offices. The hours are unpredictable. And I think if Congress were to make Congress a better place for people to work, a place where people could make careers, where they could really develop expertise and care about policy, you'd see a lot of people who want to work in public service. Money is not the only motivator for people. Certainly a lot of people choose jobs that pay less because they value the work. So I don't think you have to pay as much as lobbyists, but you have to give people the money and salary and working conditions that make it a place where you want to build a career. And I mean, we spend 0.06% of the congressional of the federal budget on Congress. Collectively, we spend less on Congress, House and Senate. The entire budget for the House and the Senate is under $2 billion, whereas corporations collectively spend $2.6 billion on reported lobbying. So I think that's a problem.
And a little bit eye-opening when you hear the numbers drawn out for you that way. You contend that corporate lobbyists and large campaign contributors have different functions in the influence game. So what role does each play?
Well, when you think about large campaign contributors, you think about these wealthy donors who are Sheldon Adelson or Tom Steyer or Michael Bloomberg or any of the names that have become well known to us, as well as many other large donors who are not as well known to us but contribute $50,000, $100,000. They're essentially playing a gatekeeping role in who can run for office, which is to say that in order to become a candidate, you need to show that you can raise a lot of money. In order to raise a lot of money, you have to have a set of policy positions that some set of rich donors are going to say, gee, we'd like that person in office. And if you can't appeal to some set of rich donors, you're not going to be a member of Congress. So they effectively play a gatekeeping role. There's not a lot of, not much quid, I mean, there's certainly occasional examples of quid pro quo. One has been recently, there was a case brought against a senator from New Jersey, Menendez, but this is not the norm. So they sort of play a large gatekeeping role, large donors. Now, corporate lobbying, corporations spend 13 times more on their lobbying than they do on their PAC contributions. Certainly some CEOs and executives make contributions, but the real action is in the day-to-day of legislating. It's in going there, sending your lobbyists to talk to congressional staffers, to help them to draft legislation, to work with them to build coalitions. A lot of it is not particularly sexy work. It's just a kind of day-to-day grind of being there all the time, constantly talking to people, constantly making your case, building coalitions, mobilizing grassroots constituencies to the extent that they're needed, and just being everywhere all the time.
Do you think that lobbyists have made it harder or easier for legislators to legislate?
I think it depends on what issues. I think certain issues, it's easier for members of Congress to legislate because there are a bunch of corporate lobbyists who are basically happy to do the work for them. In other areas, it's much harder because there are a lot of corporate lobbyists who say, you're not going to do that. You're not going to enact that policy. We're going to make sure that you don't do it. Overall, because we'll make sure you don't win re-election and that kind of thing, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about. I actually think it's because we will lobby the heck out of everybody and convince them why this is bad policy, and it's going to be a lot of work for you.
Okay.
Look, a lot of members of Congress are actually in very safe seats. They're not worried about re-election. Some of them are, but they're not. The threat of somebody of some corporation knocking a member of Congress out of office is an incredibly overstated threat, and that's just not how lobbying works. Mm-hmm. And I think we spend way too much time focusing on the campaign finance aspect of things and way too little time thinking about the importance of the day-to-day lobbying, of just being there and showing up and making a persuasive and a pervasive case for some set of perspectives.
You know, you mentioned Senator Robert Menendez, accused of doing political favors for a longtime campaign contributor. How exactly does that differ from the business-as-usual interplay between money men and legislators?
Well, so typically most members of Congress, I think, are actually pretty careful about not wanting to do favors for campaign or very blatant favors for campaign contributors, because there is a Justice Department that keeps tabs on this. There's a very large press corps in Washington and a lot of watchdog groups that are really trying to find the next scandal. So I think all that and the political process is actually, I mean, it's not as transparent as many people would like it to be, but there is a certain amount of accountability and that comes from all the watchdogs and all the journalists. So rarely do you see favors that blatant. But I think what you do see is kind of a sense of what I would call self-interested worldview osmosis, where if you're a member of Congress and you go to a lot of fundraisers and you talk to a lot of rich donors and they say, hey, we think that taxing the rich is a bad idea because then we won't invest in job creations. And you hear that over and over again, and you hear it made from people who are eloquent and well-dressed and charming personally, and also happen to be supporting your campaign. You start to say, well, yeah, maybe I'm not going to, maybe that's fine. And besides, there are plenty of other things that I can work on. I don't have to work on increasing the progressivity of the tax code. And it changes your focus. It changes your perspective. It's a much softer form of influence. There's no bribery, there's no quid pro quo, but you gradually decide what issues should I focus on, what things should I say, how should I kind of understand important economic or policy issues, and so it's much softer.
Yeah. In the case of Senator Menendez, do you think the Justice Department has a good case against him?
I have no idea. I'm not in the Justice Department, and
you're not going to go down that road with me, are you?
I think it depends on who. As with a lot of these cases, it depends how the trial goes, who testifies, what they say, how credible they are.
Sure. Okay. We'll let you go on that one, I guess. Lee Drutman, political scientist, fellow at New America, author of the book, The Business of America is Lobbying, How Corporations Became Politicized and Politics Became Corporate. Lee, thank you so much for your time with us today. We look forward to having you back again soon.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Jim.
Thank you very much. And this is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, California Congressman Xavier Becerra.
The president getting a big defeat on TPA in the Trade Promotion Authority in the Senate. And then he called Democrats down to the White House. They reached a compromise, and it looks like today they're going to vote to move that legislation out of the Senate, where it goes to the House. What fate does it face in the House? Here's a man who knows. Xavier Becerra is the head of the Democratic Caucus, part of the Democratic leadership, representing California's 34th Congressional District, and a longtime good friend from California days. Congressman, it's good to see you. Thanks
Bill,
for coming in.
Good to be with you.
We've been working on getting you in the studio for a long time. So glad we finally made it.
Amen.
You're a busy man. So I have to ask you, first of all, our good friend, Senator Barbara Boxer, is not going to run for re-election. That opens up a big Senate seat from California. Are you going to run?
You want me to make a big announcement here?
Right here. Come on, why not? Let's sound the trumpets here. Let's go.
I am seriously considering it, but let's just say for right now that I will likely take another month, maybe two, to make a final decision. It's a big move. I'm very fortunate that folks in California have let me play a pretty significant leadership role in the House of Representatives. Doing something like Senate would be phenomenal, especially because our state needs someone who can hit the ground running and really deliver. We have this syndrome, as you know, here in Washington, D.C., called the ABC syndrome, anywhere but California.
Yeah,
people think California is too big, it's too far away, and so it's tough for us to get our fair share. And so we need someone who understands what it takes to get our fair share. So I'm going to give it a great deal of thought. But whatever I do, I want to make sure that I can continue to serve the people of California.
And I know there are a lot of people in California who've encouraged you to take a serious look at it. Yeah. And the idea of being, I believe, the first Latino senator from California. Right. Would be something to shoot for.
It's not bad being the fourth-ranking Democrat in the House of Representatives either.
Also, right. Yeah. So in that, if you didn't make the big announcement today, we look forward to whenever you make the big announcement.
I'll have to come back.
Do you think you have that much time to?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you do. It's tough in the sense that running for any office in California is very expensive. But look, I've got family to consider. I've got the whole issue of finances, how you make it happen, because you don't just win by showing up. You have to raise money these days. And it's an issue of doing what I think is going to be best for my state. Other than Nancy Pelosi, I think I'm in the highest ranking position in the House of Representatives as a California member.
Of course, yes.
Right. And so you don't just throw that away. It took me 22 years to get to that point, and we have to make sure that California is fairly represented in Washington, D.C. I'm not just going to give that up. I want to make a good decision. And at the end of the day, if it works for my family, it works in terms of actually winning, and it works for my state and the folks in Los Angeles who've helped me tremendously to get here, then I'll do it.
In your position as head of the Democratic caucus, you made headlines yesterday that Republicans should not count on Democrats to bail them out on fast track. What do you mean?
The Republicans fashioned a fast track bill, which they knew was going to have opposition from Democrats from the get-go because it left out some very important elements to make trade work so that we catch the cheaters. You have to have enforcement in any kind of trade bill. And having run a bill that was essentially partisanly crafted, they should not be surprised that it's tough to get bipartisan votes. And now they're finding that they're losing partisan votes on the Republican side as well, and so they're having some issues about whether they can pass their own bill. Now they're asking us for support, but they don't want to make adjustments to address the job concerns, helping small businesses in America fight when it comes to making sure that they can compete in any trade deal. And so if they're not willing to make those accommodations to get Democratic votes, they should not expect us to bail them out.
I go to the White House briefings every day, Congressman, and I just wanted to run a couple of things that we are told every day, right, by you, and see what your reaction is. One is, and Josh Earnest yesterday, again, the press secretary, called this, they're calling it the the Progressive Trade Promotional Authority, that this is the most progressive trade deal ever crafted by any president, so that progressives like yourself and me, we ought to love this deal.
Well, either that means that our promotional authority to give fast track a chance has been extremely regressive, or we haven't yet figured out how to really do this in a way that deals with tomorrow, because there are portions in this fast-track legislation. We're not talking about the trade deal with the Pacific Rim countries. That's a separate deal, right? We have a fast-track bill to give the president a chance to put his trade deal, the TPP, directly before Congress with just one single vote, up or down. If you don't get TPA, Trade Promotion Authority legislation through, then that TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, goes through Congress through the normal course of amendments and all the rest. And so TPA, this Trade Promotion Authority bill,
that's the first step. And
that's the bill that's up this week in the Senate. It's better than it has been, but who thinks that trade has worked totally well for America over the last 20-some-odd years since NAFTA? We've got to make improvements. We know what those improvements are, and we shouldn't say that we're going to close our eyes to those things that we need to do, especially going after the cheaters around the world, in order to make America's markets available to all these foreign countries for import. So
it's asking a lot to ask Congress to give up all of its authority, to give the president a blank check, basically, and then when he's done with the deal, you get to vote up or down, no amendments.
Yeah, it is. The Constitution gives Congress the authority to move on trade deals. I can understand why it's important to let the president negotiate a deal on behalf of all Americans and then not have it tinkered with completely, so that by the time Congress votes it out, it doesn't even look like what the president negotiated with all these countries. All these countries would say, we're not negotiating with you if that's a deal. So I understand the need to try to narrow the scope of how you deal with trade deals, but that doesn't mean that Congress should be left out of the mix when it comes to making the trade deals that under the Constitution we're the ones that have to approve.
Now, have you read the deal? Have you read the...
I've read portions. I've read significant portions. I've read the portions that worry me most. But it's very difficult to read the whole thing because you're not allowed to. I can't carry around a copy of the trade deal. Now, the Trade Promotion Authority bill is different.
Yes,
that's just a bill. That's the mechanics
that's
of
the
making.
fast track.
That's
right.
the fast track. That's the mechanics of getting to trade deals. Yes, I have read.
That's the other thing that we're told every day. We're told it again yesterday. Anyone who says they can't read this deal is not telling the truth because they can go anytime they want to this room and they can read that deal. So therefore, they ought to just shut up, right? It's not as easy.
No, it's not.
Right?
No, it's not. Yes, I can read the deal, but I can't take notes and take those notes home with me. I have to remember what I read in a several hundred-page document.
You can't take a copy of it with you.
You can't take a copy with me. I can't have staff in there helping me understand some of these provisions. No, it's look. There is a great deal of confidentiality to it because these are arrangements with other countries that haven't yet publicized what they're willing to concede to get something from us. I get that. It's a negotiation. But at the same time, it's Congress's responsibility to vote on these things. It's Congress who decides if we have a trade deal, not the White House, not anyone else. And so Congress has to be well informed. Any constituent of mine, any voter would kick me out of office if I said I voted on this because I trusted some other politician to tell me if it was good or bad for the folks back home. Mm-hmm. I have a right to read it, and I should be able to understand it too.
Yeah, I have to tell you, from a journalist point of view too. Again, sitting at the briefing, I hear members of Congress say about these. They're not arbitration panels. It's what they're, these special appeals panel where the companies can. Whatever they call them, I forget.
They're essentially arbitration panels.
Arbitration panels. So members of Congress say this arbitration panel gives these companies the opportunity to really challenge our laws and maybe even overturn. The White House says that's not true because the deal says that. Well, my problem is I can't read the deal and find out what's in it, who's telling the truth, right? Yeah. Again, they just say you have to trust us. Right?
Yeah, that's
trust but verify. Somebody said that from California.
Actually, quite honestly, for me, there's no element of trust in these things. Anytime someone wants access to our markets, which could imperil American jobs, I'm not about trust. I'm about making sure this is working, and I got to see it in the body of the deal. I got to see it in the contract. It's like you wouldn't go buy any car from any car dealer without having inspected the vehicle, having the paperwork on the vehicle. We should not accept any trade deal that opens up our markets to all sorts of foreign competition without knowing if we're going to have access to their markets in equal ways. And remember, we can trust our courts, even though I disagree with our court decisions sometimes. We can trust our courts far more than we can trust the courts of some of these countries who have less developed institutions. And if I have to trust those courts to do the right thing, and they haven't been doing the right thing in the first place, explain that to me.
All right, so it looks like TPA will get out of the Senate in its amended form or whatever. Then it comes to the House. If you had to guess today, does the President have the votes in the House for the Fast Track Authority?
Well, first, I don't know if the Senate is such a done deal.
Okay.
The talk is that the votes will be there to get the
assuming
fast track
it does.
bill. Yeah, assuming it does. At this stage, the way Republicans are talking about the number of Republicans who are not there, it would be difficult to see it passing. I've been through numerous trade deals. Some I voted for, some I voted against. But one thing I do find is that there are ways to get votes. And it wouldn't surprise me if a number of things are done to try to get votes. Whether they get there or not, that they have to climb that mountain.
What's going to happen with immigration reform?
It's going to happen. It's going to happen.
Is it going to happen under this president?
It should. If it could, it would. I'm losing a lot of shoulds, woulds, coulds.
Right.
But it will. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And it's a matter of when enough of my Republican colleagues will say, this is enough. Let's just get it done. The votes are there even today. If a bill were put on the floor like the Senate's bipartisan bill,
which passed what
bill,
now 2 years?
68 votes out of 100. Almost 2 years ago. If it were put on the floor, it would pass. But Republican leadership has restricted any ability to do immigration reform. We may see some immigration bills come up. Whether they're actually constructive, I don't know. But It's coming. And it's coming not just because it's the right thing to do. It's not just because our hearts are torn every time we see these families split apart. It's going to happen because businesses need predictability, and they have to know that there are rules under which they can operate so that they're not hiring people who don't have authorization to work. It's going to happen because it creates jobs. It's going to happen because it's good for the economy. And it's going to happen because at the end of the day, you can't, in the most important country in the world, have an economy that's based in some part on having 11 million people who operate in the shadows. Put all that economy, all that economic activity above board, take it out of the shadows, and you get higher tax receipts, you get less opportunity to exploit workers. It's good for everybody.
It's going to happen also, isn't it, because of political reality and political necessity, and maybe someday. We've seen this happen in California, Congressman.
Yeah. The sum of everything I said is making the political reality come before us soon.
Where Republican Pete Wilson, right, with Prop 187, went after the Latino community, and look where the Republican Party is today in California.
So goes California, so goes the nation. So it's coming. It's coming. I can feel it after being here 22 plus years. I know the difference because when I first got here in 93, as you mentioned, 94 was Prop 187. Then in D.C., Republicans started to try to replicate what Prop 187 did and Pete Wilson did. It's a different world.
What do you think of the job Jerry Brown's doing as governor of California? Second time around.
Let me tell you, anytime you can turn around an economy like that, it inspires people. It gives you enthusiasm. It makes you believe. It gives you confidence. And I tip my hat to the governor. He's done a pretty good job. I wish he would be a little bit more progressive in some of his actions. But it's hard to blame a guy who's been able to give Californians a sense that they're moving forward. So I tip my hat to him.
For a second act, right? It's a pretty good one.
Not a bad second act. Don't be surprised if some folks start to say Brown for president.
Boy.
It's out there.
Including Jerry Brown.
If he were 10 years younger, there's no doubt. He'd be ahead of the pack.
He's got ideas.
Yeah.
He now knows, after having experienced the governorship, mayor of Oakland, having run the Democratic Party, he's taking all those experiences and applying them. And I think that's what happens when you have some experience under your belt. You feel pretty confident about moving forward.
It's good to have him there, and it's really good to have you where you are, Congressman, as well. And if you move forward, then Godspeed to you. Yeah. Thanks so much for coming in.
We'll get some good things done. Thanks,
We'll get you back again soon.
Okay.
All right. Congressman Xavier Becerra from 34th Congressional District in California.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Barney Frank, Lee Drutman, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.